Welcome to the Common Threads podcast. I'm your host, Kate Hall. Today is our first official interview episode, and I'm so excited to be starting this journey with all of you. If you haven't already listened to our introductory episode, I would encourage you to do so. It kind of just explains the purpose of this podcast and what I'm hoping to share through these interviews. This idea has been years in the making, so I'm just so happy to be finally recording our first interview. Before we begin, I thought I'd give just a short explanation of how these interviews will work going forward. Each of these guests have volunteered to let me interview them. They filled out a survey prior to this interview with some questions about experiences that they've had in their lives that changed how they see the world. So we'll be referencing that survey throughout today's episode and the other interviews going forward. Our guest today is incredible. He graciously allowed me to use him as my guinea pig. He's a super good friend of mine and just so happens to have podcasting experience, which is a total bonus for me. So today we'll be interviewing my friend McKay. He is a freelance writer and producer, as well as a full-time barista living in Salt Lake City, Utah. McKay has lived all over the world and has so many incredible experiences to share with us. So I couldn't be more excited to kick off this podcasting journey with him. Before we get in, just a quick note. The Common Threads podcast does not promote or endorse any specific political ideologies, parties, or affiliations that may be discussed in his interviews. These views and opinions expressed in each episode are solely those of the guest. The host will attempt to remain neutral, non-judgmental, and committed to creating a respectful, open space for all guests, regardless of their background, story, or beliefs. This podcast exists to promote humility, understanding, and listening, nothing more and nothing less. So, with all of that, let's jump right in. Like, hey, how are you?
I'm great. I'm thrilled to be here on the Common Threads podcast. This is awesome. I'm very
Thanks
excited.
for joining us. So excited. So, I kind of introduced you a little bit at the beginning, but if
Mhm.
you want to further introduce yourself, maybe add some things that I might have missed, just give us a little background about you.
Um, yeah, I mean, you kind of hit the big sweeping things. Yeah, I kind of am currently working the inevitable fate of someone who works in writing and podcasting, which is I work at Starbucks. So, but yes, I've been passionate about politics feels I don't know. We could talk about it more, but there's
Yeah,
an
yeah.
element of privilege involved saying it's like an interest or a hobby or something. But it's something that's been actively on my mind a lot for my whole adult life, and it's something I'm constantly thinking about and evolving and trying to get better at. I don't know, aligning my views with the values that matter to me. So, yeah, this is great. This is the kind of stuff I'm thinking about all the time. So.
Awesome. Yeah, well, again, we're so excited to have you. And like I said, we're going to be referencing the survey that McKay filled out. So I wanted to kind of start with your early life experiences. You mentioned that you went to elementary school in both Michigan and Sao Paulo. So two very different places. What was that like for you?
Yeah, yeah, great. Um, so I was in Detroit until I was 8, and so I don't have a ton of like super vivid memories, very formative kind of young childhood memories. But what was cool about living there was, and something that I hold dear to me now is, I was in the suburb of Detroit called Dearborn, which, like I mentioned to you, Kate, is it's the highest proportional population of Muslim community in the United States. So it's a very diverse town. It's a lot of, a lot of the girls in my elementary school classes were wearing hijabs, and a lot of my friends in elementary school were from, other countries. And while I wasn't thinking about politics then, at the very least, I'm very grateful that as a, white man, who very easily could live in a bubble, got to be a little bit more exposed to people from other religious faiths, other places. And the same goes for Brazil. When I lived there, excuse me, I was going to an international school. So m most of my friends were either from South Korea or Pakistan. And my best friend was actually from India. So it was very cool and formative for me as a child to yeah, I don't know, just get to know different kinds of people, people different than me. My internal life at home was very insulated from cultural influence. My parents were very conservative, very religious, and very I don't know. We didn't. We were very closed in, very insulated from the world around us, even while living in Brazil or Detroit. And so, getting to make friends that way outside of the home very early on in my life, um, I don't know, allowed me to be I would like to think a less bad person than I could have been. I don't know. I'd like to hope.
Yeah. How is so you talked about this like kind of dissonance that you had with what you were experiencing at home and what you were experiencing at school. How did that affect how you saw the world as a whole at a young age?
When I look back, especially at my life as a young person, I remember doing a lot of mental gymnastics. So I moved from Brazil to Arizona, and I lived in Arizona for essentially high school before I moved away for college. And Arizona is a very Hispanic state. You know, there's a lot of immigration. There's a lot of Mexican people that move up into Arizona, documented and undocumented. And so you're very surrounded by immigrant culture, and um, it I was hearing a lot of things at home and on the news and what's on the TV about immigrants, about these people. Um, and especially as a kid, I don't know. Some kids are smarter than I am, but for me, I was really devoted to what my parents were telling me, and so I was doing a lot of gymnastics to try and reconcile, the reality of the friends I had made in from other countries, the friends I had made from, Mexico or of Mexican descent, reconciling that to what, Bill O'Reilly was telling my parents about, the immigrants at 7 p.m. every night. I don't realize I was doing it at the time, but I remember, having to do a lot of mental juggling to reconcile those two. And ultimately, often, especially when I was young, that juggling would land on the side of what my parents were telling me about that, like, oh, those kids are sweet, but, those people or whatever, or it's very easy to be compassionate to people you see every day while still maintaining some level of animosity to kind of a nebulous group out there. And it's easier to do that mental gymnastics if you can separate those two. So I can think, oh, my friend, at school whose parents came from Mexico, they're great, but like I've been told, the immigrants are taking our jobs or whatever, whatever the rhetoric is. It's so much easier to maintain that level of cruelty or animosity or bigotry towards a group that you're not seeing every day. And I remember doing that a lot, especially as a teenager, I like to think I was trying to be a nice kid and a kind person. Um, and in my mind, at least while I was still in high school, while I was growing up, I didn't see that being a kind person is impossible while maintaining some of those feelings about those nebulous groups that I am compartmentalizing in my brain, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense. When do you feel like that shift took place for you, where maybe you started to break out of like what your parents were teaching and starting to kind of follow that belief that you had kind of always been nurturing a little bit?
Yeah, it definitely was a slow process that very much correlated with just like my coming into adulthood. So um, I it's funny. It's always hard to tell, I guess, sometimes in retrospect when you believe certain things. But sometimes I'll get like a Facebook memory of like a post that I posted when I was like 14. Like, for example, I got a post recently that I posted when I was 13 that was like a pro-life, anti-abortion post on Facebook. I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Also, why was I posting about politics at 13? And also, I
Yeah.
super don't feel that way now. Um, but then I also got a post, a memory from when I was 16, just a couple days ago, where I was posting about an art exhibit I'd gone to that was done completely by undocumented people who had swum across the Rio Grande to get to the United States. And I was
Mm.
like, whoa, that was a little bit more progressive than I thought it was as a 16-year-old. So I think there was a little bit of that happening over the course of my adolescence, but it really kind of kicked into gear when I left home and went to college. I came to college up in Utah at a very conservative college and at BYU, and I definitely still was digging my heels about some of my politics, but I was starting to realize I didn't agree with my parents about a lot of things. Um, it, I didn't agree about a lot of things, and it slowly happened. I think it's still a process I'm in the middle of, but it definitely those first few years, the ages maybe 19 to 23, was when I kind of fundamentally overhauled my worldview, realizing that the way that I felt about immigrants, the way that I felt about gay people, the way that I felt about women and black people and disabled people was pretty at odds with m most, if not all, of what I'd been told growing up. At least about those groups of people. I do feel like I was raised to be compassionate. And so that was kind of the disconnect I was kind of
Hmm.
slowly working the edges off of over time.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, that's kind of the vague answer. But that's kind of definitely what has happened is as my frontal lobe developed, maybe I realized what was going on.
Yeah. No, I love that. I loved how you mentioned that you were still in the process of like figuring out your beliefs. I think that's such a powerful and beautiful thing is that like you don't always have to have it all figured out. Especially when you're like a teenager or in college, you think everyone thinks that they should have like all their beliefs figured out. And I love that you're just like open-minded enough to kind of figure that out. And yeah, I just thought that was really beautiful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I wanted to shift a little bit to so you went to college and then you served an LDS mission in New York
Hmm.
City. Is that right? During
Yeah.
2016?
Hmm.
Um, yeah. So first of all, really cool place to spend a couple of years. I mean, I love New York
Yeah, I got
and
lucky.
yeah, I think it's just such a cool place. But tell us a little bit about that experience. I mean, definitely a very different environment from where you grew up and probably a lot of different beliefs that you were presented with over there. So tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, I mean it's a funny thing. Um, and you know this, but for those listening, like LDS missions are funny because you get kind of randomly assigned somewhere in the world to go, and you're going there as a 19-year-old or 18-year-old to try and convert people to Mormonism. So I wasn't going to New York with the mindset of I'm going to learn about these cultures and
Yeah.
allow my worldview to be changed. If anything, I was going there to do the opposite. But it's a beautiful thing about New York. I love the city is that it's, you know, the most culturally diverse place in the world. I was lucky enough to be assigned there as a Spanish speaking LDS missionary. So I was working exclusively with the immigrant community and almost exclusively with undocumented immigrants because that's what the reality of life is in like New York. And I spent most of my time there in Queens, in a part of Queens called Corona, Queens, which is an incredibly. I saw a statistic once. I'd have to double fact check this, but I think it was something along the lines of it's like the densest Latin American community proportional to the population there in the country,
Hmm.
to the point where like the road, like the restaurant signs, everything's in Spanish. Like they don't
Oh,
even
cool.
put it in
Yeah.
English. It's such a cool part of the country. Um, and as just the more time I spent there, it was like I said, kind of that dissonance between the values I thought I did hold, which is compassion and community. That dissonance became more and more apparent to me. And so being there in 2016 was a lot because considered myself a Republican. That's what I'd been raised to think was the compassionate, selfless, community-driven, kind political group. And then I'm in this community of people that I loved. I was there to, in my eyes, help them in the religious views I held at the time. And I was spending all my day knocking on doors and meeting these families that would bring me to their home and feed me. And I'd learned Spanish and getting to know these people and making friends. And then to hear the rhetoric that Trump was spewing in his 2016 campaign and hear the kind of hate and vitriol he had for this community. And Trump is someone who'd grown up in that city, who lived in New York City, who was around this same community and had looked these people in the eyes. Well, he didn't spend much time in Crown of Queens, I'm sure, but he'd seen these people and he had the same opportunity to be exposed to their culture and their lifestyle as I did. Um, and could just hate them so vitriolically and so blatantly. And to see the country so wholeheartedly, not wholeheartedly, but more of the country than I would have expected support him in that was shocking to me as a 19 to 21-year-old. This is the time I spent there. I remember distinctly the day after the election. So this would have been November 7th, I guess, 2016, 2015. Oh my God. Yes. Okay.
2015. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, no, 2016, because then he's inaugurated 2017. Sorry. Anyways.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, it's okay. I'm doing math poorly in my head. I remember with, he was the leader of the Hungary at the time. He was they call him the branch president. He sat down with us and just sobbed for an hour because he had been trying to get his papers in order for 18 years and he hadn't seen his kids in that time. This is a man who, because a talking point that you hear a lot on Fox News, I heard it from my parents, is that like these immigrants come over and they don't want to pay taxes, they don't want to contribute to their communities, they want to take, and they bring drugs and they bring crime or whatever. And I'm sitting here with this man who had prayed every day to be able to pay taxes. He would have done anything for a social security number, for a driver's license, for he wanted more than anything to be able to bring his kids here, to build a life here the life that I had had through no merit of my own, through just luck of where I'd been born and who I was born, the house I was born into. This was someone who would have done anything for it and had been yearning for it for years, and he was sobbing because he just knew that under this new presidency, it would be impossible, or at the very least, a lot harder because it was a presidency that had been publicly hateful towards his demographic, him as a person. That was very eye-opening for me. Just sitting there as someone who had had privilege my whole life, and was only kind of just starting to become aware of it, maybe. Um, it was a visceral kind of upheaval in my brain of, like the the difference between what I thought I was and what I actually was, if that makes sense. Like I just
Yeah.
knew that I was not whatever Donald Trump was. And if the party was supporting him, then I'm not that. What I was whatever it was that was kind to this man who's sitting with me crying about wanting to see his kids again. And yeah, and that was fairly early on in my time in New York. And so from then on, I did a lot of growing and specifically in respect to, immigrants and those beliefs, but that kind of in religious deconstruction terms, they call it breaking your shelf. But that was kind of my shelf breaker politically, which was that kind of all of a sudden started opening the door to all the rest of my beliefs that I'd been raised with, and realizing, okay, like I don't think I'm quite as comfortable as I thought with the way my conservative upbringing feels about, the queer community, or even about women, or disabled people, or all these different, minority demographics. But yeah, it that was kind of the start, but it was hard, and it's it sounds like lame because of the privilege that I have, but like it is a lot of hard work as someone who, again, through no merit of my own, was born into kind of basically every majority demographic as like a cisgendered heterosexual white man in the upper middle class. I was financially stable upbringing. Um, it's hard work. Again, hard is relative, but like it's work to have to step out of that bubble and like force yourself to be involved with and care for all these groups that it would, logistically be easier for me to stay within my bubble and enjoy the privilege that I have and be a bigot, like, and not undo the biases that I've been that I've been raised with. And so that was kind of the start of the real work, I think, in my life of doing that, of realizing like up until then, it'd been kind of a passive experience of growing up and being exposed to different cultures and loving the people around me and kind of loving the cultures they're from. But that time in my life around the age of 19 or 20 was when it really realized like there's serious change that needs to happen in me and in the way I see and treat the world, in what I label myself as and identify as politically, ideologically, religiously. So that was the start of that path in earnest.
That's really cool. I think you should definitely give yourself credit for that because it is hard work to kind of step outside yourself. I mean, I've gone through kind of a similar journey in finding what I believe in stuff, and it is hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to think like this could be bigger than me and what is everyone else going through and having that kind of empathy and compassion for other groups. So I applaud you for going through that, and at such a young age, So, um,
Sure. I guess,
yeah,
well, the reason I qualify so much is because I don't want to ever be mistaken for saying that the hard work of being compassionate for a minority group is in any way comparable to the difficulty of being a part of an oppressed minority group,
right, right,
Like I'll never claim that I am in any way, it's all relative and it's yeah, anyways, that's why I guess
right.
I qualify myself so much because I don't want to come off as tone deaf to what life is actually like for people that don't have all this privilege that I've been born with.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that explanation for sure.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to ask, so that can be kind of a lonely journey, is to kind of go through that, especially, in an LDS mission environment where you maybe have one or two companions that you're with constantly, and then obviously you're going out into the community, but that's really your only interaction. You're not able to talk to your family all the time. Nowadays, it's changed a little bit, but how, like, did you voice any of these concerns with your family? Was it more of like an internal journey, or were you kind of like outwardly, questioning things, asking people for their opinions, or yeah.
hmm Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me at that specific period of time, while my shelf had broken politically, it still was very firm religiously.
Mhm.
I was still very devout in my religious faith, and so at that time, and would be that way for a couple of more years. It has not remained that way. Um, but at that time, what it really was for me was I was turning all of that confusion and frustration and desire to change into my religious faith at the time.
Mhm.
And the thing with an artifact of the Mormon Church is that there is kind of a space, a community of people that are in that same mindset, that feel maybe a little bit more open-minded and compassionate towards these minority groups than the institutional organization does, but want to remain within the organization. And so that's kind of where I found myself for a while was trying to find other kind of like-minded people that it felt similarly compassionate towards immigrants, towards queer people, towards, all these groups, but weren't necessarily finding themselves 100% at odds with the organization. And again, I use mental gymnastics a lot as a phrase, but I find it very accurate and descriptive of what is kind of constantly happening in that space of trying to maintain myself within um, the label and the group of the LDS Church, which is a church that is pretty like institutionally opposed to the existence of queer and trans people and institutionally in support of, striated hierarchies for racial groups. And anyways, let's go down that rabbit hole so much. But I was doing a lot of mental gymnastics to figure out how I could do that. And so it was mostly an internal path for me at that point in time. Um, but the nice thing was as I continued to like meet and connect with people that felt similarly to me, I got married pretty soon after I got back to someone who felt similarly to me. That kind of allowed me to slowly put myself in a place that was kind of, I guess, fertile ground for me to make the change that I really needed to make, which was also to rethink my religious beliefs, and kind of my entire worldview, not just my like party affiliation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned on your survey, you got married after your mission, and then these were kind of some formative years for you. So maybe
hmm
just kind of walk us through that experience of getting married, and like how maybe that changed your view or your worldview.
Yeah. So it kind of feels maybe like a parallel experience to my experience in New York City. Um, and maybe it's kind of the story of my life is that like again, like as somebody who's a member of every majority group, there's a very clear and easy, maybe easy is not the perfect word, but an easy path in life to maintain kind of the that insulation and that opaque view of the world around you and to sit comfortably on your privilege because the systems in this country are set up to benefit someone like me. And so kind of the story of my adult life is, I guess, first maybe in earnest starting with my experience meeting, the people I met in New York, but then getting married. And I grew up with sisters. I love my sisters, but it really was when I got married that I really had a real earnest view to what it's like being a woman in America. As you know, we got married really young at 22, and we're trying to navigate the difficulty of choosing a career, going through college, working in different workplaces as a woman. And I was so, I was devoted to her. We're no longer married now, but very committed to her happiness. And I was constantly trying to think of how to make her life better. That was kind of eye-opening again into, I guess, this other group of people, which is women. Which again, it feels people will listen to this and think, okay, how hard is it to just be empathetic to women? And obviously not hard, but again, it is like work as a man. It's not, at least for me, or in the upbringing that I had, it wasn't something that was so spoon-fed to me, which is that kind of clear-eyed empathy to what it's like living within the patriarchy, as a woman. And so getting married did that for me. It was very eye-opening and very frustrating. It was a lot of experiences, especially because we were, going to church every week. We both went to a college that was owned by the church that we went to every week, and I was employed full time by the that college that was owned by the church. So we were very interconnected with the ideology that we'd been raised in, which was Mormonism, and Mormonism is very interconnected with American conservatism. So um, we we were in that all the time, and so coming home every night, and she was also growing up and kind of developing her beliefs, and coming home every night, and talking about the frustrations, bosses that were discriminating, or comments that were made in church meetings, or biased teaching at college because we went to a school that, because it was owned by a church, doesn't have to meet all the discrimination guidelines of other schools. They've got a lot of exemptions in that respect. um that was eye-opening, and it was infuriating for me. I mean, and infuriating for me, much more infuriating to actually be a woman. But me as someone who was realizing, like, I've been told all of my life that, like, differing gender roles, traditional gender roles is a big thing in the Mormon church. And so it was something that I realized I didn't agree with. That was also a time in my life when I landed on the college major that I wanted to do, which was English literature. And something cool about BYU was that while I had previously been a pre-dental major because I wanted to make money, and that was the only thing that informed that decision, I realized I was miserable. As soon as I switched to humanities, it was kind of a night and day shift in the kinds of professors I was getting and the level of, I guess, like, human empathy and kindness that those professors had in their hearts. Not to generalize about pre-dental professors, but I guess at least I had some bad ones. So, reading, all I was doing was reading. I was reading for school, I was reading for fun, I was reading and writing, and you know, again, it's imperfect. Most of the authors I was reading were white men. That's what classic literature is. But I still, over time, was slowly getting more and more exposed to those different worldviews than mine, and realizing that, like, the love and compassion I had in my heart for these people as I'm reading the words they're writing, as I'm talking to my spouse, as I'm reading the news, like, was incompatible with a lot of the worldviews I had previously. So the especially being married was, if living in New York helped me to kind of maybe disrupt the foundation of my political identity, being married is what really was pivotal in helping me to disrupt the foundation of my religious identity. And kind of between the two of those, that was kind of the majority of my like external ideology, if that makes sense. And again, it was a slow process, but that, yeah, was formative, I guess, to
Yeah.
oversimplify.
It sounds like she was a good outlet. And you guys were kind of like a sounding board for having like similar ideas. I'm
Hmm.
curious if like you had any other friends or family, if they were kind of supportive in your guys' journey, or if it really was just the two of you, or like kind of what that external
Hmm.
relationships looked like during that time.
Yeah, it's kind of a lonely time. She and I got married in the spring of 2019, and so spring of 2020, famously lonely time, or the start of a lonely time for everybody. So we
Right.
we spent a lot of time just kind of with each other, with our school, people we affiliated with at school, and then also at work. So for me, I got really lucky. I was working in podcasting at the time. I was working for BYU. But I got lucky in that I was working on a show with a really spectacular group of people. The host of my show and my boss and our executive producer, they were people that, while all, members of that church, um, were very progressive. That they were very the a beautiful thing about kind of the entertainment industry. It's kind of a very progressive place in general. It definitely has its issues, but at least the performers and the actors and the creators in the industry are very progressive. There are places in the world where that's less the case, but in Utah, that's definitely a place where you can find a lot of very open-minded and kind and welcoming people. And so that was incredibly helpful for me to get to be around that. And also because I was working as a writer, and then over time I became a producer and then executive producer. I kind of worked my way up, but I was spending all my time making content, doing what you're doing right now. And making content for a broadcasting station that was a part of a school that was a part of a church. So I had kind of a lot of like sponsoring institutions attached to every word I was writing. I was lucky in that, the church does a lot of um, reviewing of a lot of the content that gets put out. The stuff that I was putting out, lucky enough, was in a corner of their production that they weren't super paying a lot of attention to, if that makes sense. Not to say that I was
Yeah.
doing anything that scandalous, but I got to kind of make content that my heart wanted to a large extent. And so what that meant for me was that I spent a lot of time thinking and reflecting about the kind of things I was making. I think maybe more reflecting than I would have done if I'd been working, a different job. I was spending a lot of time thinking, okay, I have a good audience because my show did pretty well, and they also had a lot of money they were throwing at marketing our show because they're a big church. Um, and when I had like tens of thousands of people listening to everything I'm writing every week, it was kind of a burden that I did not take lightly, and I was thinking about all the time. I was always thinking about like if I'm writing something that can make someone feel better, that can make someone love themselves more, that can make someone, manage their mental health better, raise their kids better, see the world better, I have the power to do that. I was very aware of the unique position I was in of having a platform, even though I wasn't necessarily a voice on the show. I was writing most of what was said on the show. Um, and so that I'm so grateful for in retrospect because while I was also, like I mentioned, being exposed to different worldviews, opportunities to be empathetic to other people, I was also following a career path that was forcing me to think constantly about like what impact do I have on the world around me and what do I wish was different about the world around me, and that was kind of what led me to start getting more passionate about representation, about, you know, people's voices that have been systemically, held down and voices that have been lifted up. Aware of my own place as again a cis straight white dude, um, Christian at the time, you know, having the opportunity to write for tens of thousands of people while there are people without those privileges that don't, I was very aware that I worked on a team that was six women and one man, and I did most of the writing, and it was a show for women, and those are like considerations that I wouldn't have had otherwise of what that means to have a voice and to not have one. And so for me, that was huge. It still is. It's something I think about all the time, even though I'm not, working with that same platform anymore. What is it that we can do to change the world around us? And even if your platform isn't tens of thousands of people, even if it's just the people you see every day, those are things that I'm trying to keep in mind all the time. Because unless we're going for elective office, like that's really the tangible impact we'll have in our lives. And so I don't know. Anyways, that was really important to me, and it still feels very important to me in how I became the person I am now.
Mhm. So shifting gears a little bit, just kind of in the same time frame of your life.
Hmm.
You also mentioned in your survey living in Provo and having some of these different experiences. You mentioned specifically the death of George Floyd being a pivotal moment for you, as it was for a lot of us. How did your feelings about that specific event and maybe other events to align or clash with what you were seeing around you in Provo?
Yeah. So like the the summer of 2020 came for me at a very important kind of point in this path for me. Like I mentioned, I had been moving along the political spectrum kind of steadily over time from right to left. And kind of at this point, I was starting to feel kind of uncomfortable with some of the religious views that I'd been upholding for a long time, but still fundamentally, I was pretty adherent. Um, but the summer of 2020, like again, like you said, for a lot of people was radicalizing. I remember distinctly, up until then, I'd very much parroted there's kind of a mindset that I'd heard my whole life, kind of on the right, basically an anti-protesting mindset. Kind of the idea that like, oh, like you can have strong beliefs, but protesters ultimately are just making noise and they're ruining property and blah blah blah, whatever Tucker Carlson, is saying about it. But um, and so like I maybe not so overtly, but at the very least I had that headspace somewhere inside me. Um, and at some point after the murder of George Floyd, there was a car march in Provo, Utah, which is where we were living, and they kind of blocked the main street that runs through the town. Just hundreds and hundreds of cars, just kind of honking and with flags and signs, and they were doing like kind of a big kind of oval loop, kind of just up and down the block. And I got kind of stuck in the middle of it. I think I was on my way home from work or going to the grocery store or something that day. It had to have been June of 2020. And I was upset. I was frustrated. I'm annoyed that I was stuck in traffic. I was trying to go home. Um, and I was sitting in there. I was stuck in traffic for a long time. It must have been like 40 or 50 minutes. And I remember there was just a moment where I realized, like, why am I cutting through this protest? Why am I not a part of it? What is it? What is the difference between me and them that would lead me to be in this position and not in theirs? And that led to a lot of self-reflection. Not to mention, the news cycle of 2020, the COVID, the mask panic, living in an incredibly red state in a time when science was universally supporting masks and my legislators were not. And things along that line, like that moment and that day kind of was a big hinge in my brain of like what really needs to change about my life so that I next time am in their position and not the one, upset that they're getting blocked by the protest. Why am I not in support of this man that was murdered and I know he was murdered? And why am I more worried about getting home?
Mhm.
Um, and so that was big. 2020 was big. I'm also diabetic, and 2020 was. I have a huge extended family of a lot of passionate conservatives, and over the course of that year, I ended up blocking most of them on social media due to their views on vaccines and masks. And I mentioned I'm diabetic because there's a few family members specifically that got into it with me about. There was this big snafu in 2020 about comorbidity rates, and people were saying someone had like discovered that the CDC was counting comorbidities as COVID deaths. Those are comorbidities if you die of COVID, but you also have another sickness.
Mhm.
So like if I had died of COVID in 2020, I would have counted as a comorbidity. And I remember family members losing their mind. The CDC is lying to us, and me saying, "Well, actually, no, it makes sense. That's how science works. That's how you keep track of." Anyways, that sort of thing. It's almost like I got pushed into what would become kind of my more fully developed political view because everyone was so viscerally upset, and it was a scary time. I have a lot of empathy and grace for people not being their most polite selves online, not being their most stable selves in 2020. But at the same time, the people in my life that dug in their heels and kind of the extreme worldviews, especially the extremely bigoted worldviews, it really pushed me away from where I'd been raised. Um, and so I signed up for kind of a different course load the next year. I was getting into the latter half of my college degree, and so I signed up for some feminist lit classes. I signed up for some African American literature classes, and that was really cool. It allowed me to not only consume the content of those courses, but also be in classes surrounded by other students that were similar to me, similarly sympathetic, less closed-minded, and to be with professors that were, you know, black, queer, which isn't exceptional in a big scale, but at BYU, that's hard to find. It's pretty hard to find any professor that's not an old white straight dude that got married at 21, and you know what I mean? And so that was a big for me because all of a sudden I was able to kind of shift my whole life, especially because of COVID and lockdown, to only being around people that were open-minded, that were compassionate to people in minority groups, and that knew more about it than I did, whether they were a part of that group themselves, or at the very least, they could point me to authors, to creators, to news outlets that could help me be more informed, than I was before. And so that that kind of doubled the speed, I guess, of my path towards where I am now around that time.
Um, Um, so this is all pretty recent, like within the last few years.
Hmm.
And obviously you had time to kind of look back and reflect. But I'm wondering how do you look back on this experience now and kind of view these experiences then like when you were like right there in the moment and kind of
Hmm.
those feelings that were happening?
Yeah, I think, now just a few years removed from those kind of formative experiences, I'm at a place now where I feel like my political labels, my, you know, what I tell people that I am, whether it's religiously, politically, ideologically, that feels so aligned with the values that matter to me now that it's hard for me to look back and not feel like I've just always been this. It's hard for me to really know that person that in 2019 was, you know, in any way kind of sympathetic to the Tucker Carlsons of the world, you know? Um, but I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for like the luck I've had, I guess. And it's not all luck, I was working at it, but there is a lot of luck involved too because there's a lot of guys in my same position of privilege that, you know, spend their whole life without talking to a trans person, and again, they have access to the internet. They're adults. They're fully capable of learning about how other people feel. So I don't want to be an apologist for bigots, but I also was lucky in that like I got to have a lot of exposure early on that other people haven't had in my same position. And I can look back and be so grateful that, when that hinge, turned for me in 2020 and I was ready, that I had not a lot, but some people, I was married to somebody that was sympathetic and felt similarly. I had friends and coworkers who felt similarly. I was in a very lucky in a position to have people that were then ready to like, I guess, ferry me along my way into being a, grown ass man who can finally form his own opinions about things that aren't just formed by the way I was grown up, I was raised. So
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing those experiences and for being vulnerable with us today. I want to shift to connecting all of these into some like specific political views,
love it.
which you've touched on some of them already, but
Hmm.
I wanted to ask if you're comfortable sharing which political party you align yourself with most. And if you don't have one, that's okay.
Hmm.
But yeah, if you've got one that you align with.
Yeah, I think, so I would consider myself a socialist. The a funny thing about being a socialist is that people do have a certain expectation for you to be a theoretical expert that they don't hold for someone identifying as Democrat, Republican, Independent. So I'm always hesitant to, I'm not an expert necessarily, but I do definitely feel confident that I know enough to call myself that. And that feels closest to what feels true in my heart, if that's
So,
means anything at all. I don't know.
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. How do you feel like that identification or that label impacts your life in any way?
Um, it definitely does. I mean, and kind of how I landed there was what I've realized after all this time is that, especially in the political sphere and in general, like what I feel most strongly about is that everyone deserves, you know, rights and safety and happiness and the necessities of life. Like we live in such an abundant time technologically. There's we have more than enough resources for every person on Earth to live and eat and sleep and socially, have what they need to have a content life. And so what that has led to then is realizing more and more over time that like even calling myself a liberal was dissonant with that. The prominent figures in the liberal space are still often, pretty anti-trans people. They still often, are not wholeheartedly supporting women's bodily autonomy or, even like allowing everyone to eat or sleep, housing and food and healthcare. Healthcare is a big one, I guess I haven't mentioned yet. Um, and so I think I realized over time that like socialism and the idea of kind of community cooperation and, you know, taking care of each other, that feels most aligned with that label. As far as how that label specifically has impacted me, it hasn't too much. I do know that if I was too public about that word in like family reunion settings, some people would probably be pretty upset because I know that's a curse word for a lot of people in my life and kind of especially in kind of the right wing side of the political spectrum. Um, but I haven't necessarily thrown that around. I also haven't hidden my political views, but I'm not trying to start fights at the dinner table necessarily. So
Right.
you have to pick and choose your battles in that respect. But it has also it's been freeing to me in that it's helped me feel the most like myself I've ever felt in my life, where it feels like okay, like any political party, it's imperfect. There's a lot of people in different edges of it that believe things differently than I do. Um, and so it's complicated because there's people that outspoken in the socialist space and in the democratic socialist space that I might disagree with, but it does feel like the place where I've felt most empowered and enabled to y- actually do things that help the people around me in the way that I want to be doing. So,
Right. Right. Um, what I wanted to ask because of this like specific identity and all of the lived experiences that you've mentioned
mhm.
before, what are some things that you are most passionate about today?
That's a great question. Um, I feel kind of passionate about everything a little bit.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I mean it's kind of the big things and it's kind of the big things that kind of become stereotypes when you hear about socialist politicians and Bernie and Zoran running right now. It's really is like access to the basic necessities of life for everybody. That's, housing, food, and healthcare, kind of the big three. I feel very passionate about that, but as a part of that, there's the acknowledgement that like access to a content life within especially in the United States, which is where I live, so that's what I know. Um, there are systems that are disproportionately disadvantaging certain groups, and so being black, being queer, being a woman, yeah, and that's not everybody, but that those are some big groups. Um, that it giving people that content and dignified life is different for people in these oppressed groups than for me as a white man. And so that's a very key element of that I'm passionate about, right? You can't just, you know, make the same blanket policy for everybody when we have systems at play that are actively discriminating and making life harder and system not just systems political systems and financial systems, but also rhetorical systems. And there's mindsets and there's biases that we're all being constantly bombarded with and being raised with that need to be undone in order to make a better life for, our trans friends and our black friends, our immigrant friends, our uh, able-bodied, disabled, anybody. There needs to be care taken to the fact that things are unbalanced, and unbalanced is like the biggest understatement ever. And so that's a key part of that dignified life. So, anyways, I feel very passionate about that, which is pretty vague and wide reaching, and I'm not perfect at, I don't know, doing everything I can about it, but I try to kind of do what I can, and pick and choose, where I can have at least some influence. Where I am in Salt Lake City right now, a lot of that is working with kind of the unhoused community. Um, there it's a very present problem here, and it's a place where I can have kind of a direct impact with my kind of limited barista resources,
Mhm.
and so while I'm not there's only so much I can do to grant healthcare access to the wider community. I can, help a few homeless people every week, get access to food or find a new tent, or you know what I mean. It's an ongoing struggle, but it's also encouraging to at least be surrounded by people that are trying to do the same thing.
Mhm. Right. I love that so much. I wanted to shift just kind of some final thoughts, final questions for you as we wrap up. My first question is, what do you hope people take away from this interview today and all the thoughts and experiences that you've shared?
That is a good question. Um, I think I don't know if there's anyone I hope this interview connects with, it's people that are maybe in a similar like demographic space to me. People that have a lot of privilege. And if there's anything that I hope people can take away, it's that I have very radically changed my politics moving into adulthood, but every choice I've made politically, religiously, ideologically, the way I see the world, I've tried to found in compassion and in a desire to take care of the people around me and for us to build a community that sustainably we take care of each other. Um, and so if there's anything I hope people take away, it's that, you know, not everyone necessarily, I hope, but not everyone has to be a socialist, but like that's not a bad word. Like it, me specifically, like we're just trying to help other people, which I feel like optimistically everyone can get behind that idea. And so again, I don't expect everyone to be as quote unquote extreme as it might seem like I am, but I would hope that everyone can at least be sympathetic to the fact that like this is an honest, like compassionate and community driven effort that I'm making, and I know that the vast majority of the people in my same kind of place in the political spectrum are also just trying to do. So.
Mm. I think that's a perfect segue to my last question for you, which is what do you wish that people better understood about you and other people who see the world similarly to you? You mentioned like socialism, and being a socialist is kind of a trigger word right now. So, what do you think people
Sure.
better understood about you and other people who see the world similarly?
Yeah, I think, we're in a very intense political time right now, which I mean people have said every year for the last 242 48 years since the country was founded. Um, People have been saying that forever, but it's pretty crazy right now. We bombed Iran yesterday, so things are not looking great. Things are pretty grim in a lot of spaces. And what I hope people can do is open their mind. How do I say this in not a vague kind of trite way? Is open your mind to the idea that like a lot of these ideas, socialism being a bad word, a lot of or even just the political party of your parents, at whatever age you are, a lot of those things, those labels are so tied up in the media and rhetoric in the identity political battle that's constantly happening to try and win votes and win re-election, that they're so disconnected from the actual values that we all care about. I think a lot of the things that I believe politically, I like to think most of the country feels the same way as long as I word it the right way so they don't realize I'm maybe saying what Fox News said I'm saying. You know what I mean? Like most of the people agree that like they want, they don't want a single kid to go hungry. They don't want a person to die of medical debt because they couldn't afford their, you know what I mean? I think most people agree with those things, but we're so tied up in the labels, we're so tied up in the rhetoric we've been bombarded with our whole lives. And so if the if I, maybe what I'm hoping for is that people will maybe put an added effort into their media literacy, into their critical deconstruction of words, of terminology, of what they're being told, and allow themselves to kind of get to the root of what's happening, of what our presidential administration is doing, of what our Congress is doing, what our local, government is doing, and also what we're doing to each other, what we're talking about, and how we treat the people around us. If we have that more connected down to our base values, I really am optimistic that like the vast majority of this country is compassionate and does care about the people around them. And we can get closer to like I said, a sustainable, compassionate, caring community that takes care of each other than we have ever been. So I was long-winded and I don't know if it made any sense, but I hope so.
No, it was perfect. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I've been yapping for so long. I don't think I have anything left to say.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, McKay, for joining us. Thanks for, again, for being vulnerable and sharing your story. It was really great getting to know you better, and I'm excited for everyone to listen to this episode. So, thank you so much.
You got it. This is great.